this morning and again from Jonathan that greenhouse gas emission reduction is one of the key topics in our industry, and we also heard this morning that Scope 1 and Scope 2 reduction, this is what is closest to what every company can do. This is why we decided about a year ago within IFRA that we want to see what are our members doing in terms of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission reporting, and also how are we doing in terms of reducing the emissions. So first question, of course, was what exactly do we want to look at, and we decided to really focus on what we see as the core activity of our industry, the blending of fragrance ingredients to produce a fragrance mixture, and of course the storage that is also associated with our activities. This is important because you might know that with storage often comes cooling, and cooling needs coolants, which are often HFCs, which have a very high greenhouse gas potential. So this is also why we are not only talking about CO2 emissions, but CO2 equivalent emissions, meaning it also includes other greenhouse gases like the HFCs. Then the question was, how exactly do we want to do this study? Because we wanted to collect data from our member companies, we contracted an external advising company. They have been the ones who have really collected all the data and then put the data together, wow, I'm really loud now. Put the data together in a summarized form, and then we also interpreted the data. Here's where the IFRA members came into play as well. I have to say thank you already to a number of companies who have been supporting this study. It has been larger and smaller companies from different regions who have been with us in designing the questionnaire. So this has basically been a task done by IFRA together, of course, with the advisor, and then also when it came to reasoning why are the results like they are, of course, the insights from the industry were really helpful. And of course, I mean, the questionnaire was then in the end sent out, or the call to answer the questionnaire that was coming from IFRA, and it's really focusing on fragrance producing companies only. So if a company is only producing flavors, they were not asked here. So as mentioned before, we are, in terms of activities, focusing on the fragrance blending and storage. We wanted to have a quantifiable data from our companies, and based on this quantifiable data, we would then establish the relationship between the greenhouse gas emission intensity and the size of the company, and also analyze whether there are differences between the different regions. Altogether, we had 31 companies who answered the questionnaire. However, out of those 31 companies, 1/3 actually is not yet reporting greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2. So this is one of the results that actually also in our industry, there is still some room for improvement on that. Then another 10 companies, they are reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but they weren't able to really carve out only those emissions that come from blending and storage. So they also couldn't give us the data on these activities, which left us with 11 companies who really handed in the data. Actually, it's 4 larger companies with more than 5,000 metric tons per year of fragrance mixture production, and 7 smaller ones. And you can see down here which are the standards they deployed in reporting greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1 and 2. It's mostly the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is, I think, the key result, because this shows what were the greenhouse gas intensities of these 11 companies. And what you can see is on the left-hand side of that chart, this is where the smaller companies fall into, because this chart spans from annual fragrance production in metric tons of below 5,000 up to, at the very end, I think it's 140,000 metric tons per year. And you see the smaller companies, they actually exhibit a wide range of emission intensity. Whereas if we look at the larger companies, they kind of tend to fall in that, we called it average band of emission intensity, which is somewhere around 0.2 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per ton of fragrance mixture produced. However, I think what is really noteworthy is that the company which has the really lowest emission intensity is a small company. So you can clearly see that being efficient in your production, greenhouse gas emission efficient, this is something that is not only for large companies, but actually small companies can also achieve it. When it comes to the regional diversity, and actually this is now not every company has been able to divide their data into regional data, so this is data points from those companies who are able to do it, but what you can see is that clearly there are differences. Yeah, the emission intensity from Asian activities is roughly twice as much as it is from European and LATAM activities, with North America being somewhere in between. This is mostly due to the Scope 2 emissions, yeah, and we interpreted the data and had the feeling that really it's correlated to the grid emission factors for electricity. These are much higher in Asia or in many Asian countries than they are in LATAM or Europe, which then of course relates into the emissions you have when you use this electricity, for example, to run your motors. And actually, if we now look into detail the spread of this regional greenhouse gas emission data, what you can see that especially in the earlier years, 2020 and 2021, there have also been some outliers. Yeah, some data points were really exceptionally high. This is not there anymore in 2022. We interpret this as some actions haven't been taken by the companies. Yeah, they probably noticed that they are quite emission intensive in some of their practices, and they have been taking action. So as I mentioned before, it's not only CO2 emissions, but it's also HFC emissions. And what is interesting here is when we look at those 11 companies that replied, we see that actually 5 of them, that's the yellow ones, they report that a considerable amount of their Scope 1 emissions actually comes from HFC and not CO2 emissions. So there's one company, number 7 here, in the year 2020, they even have 91% of their Scope 1 emissions being HFC. On the other hand, there's 6 companies which don't report HFC emissions at all, which to us seemed a bit strange. Yeah, most of these companies will also have some cooling activities needing coolants, so that would be a request to companies to maybe go back and check how you're doing the Scope 1 reporting, whether you include HFC emissions from cooling activities. And finally, we also asked the companies to share some best practice examples, what they have been doing over the past years in order to reduce emissions. And again, it's really nice to see that examples came from small as well as from large companies. Yeah, so definitely activities are happening irrespective of the size of the company. And just to give you an example, for example, here small companies, they told us that insulation for hot water tanks, this is something they have been working on, installing it, and then also making sure that they maintain it and being sure they control the temperature of that water tank so that it's not higher than what is really needed. If we look at the larger companies, examples are, for example, purchase of renewable electricity, or also when it comes to the HFCs, to change the coolant in order to go to a coolant with a lower global warming potential. Yeah, so to summarize the key findings, what we have seen is when we look at the emission intensity from blending and storage of fragrance mixtures, there is a large variety between the companies, but let me stress again, the most efficient company has been a small company. Actually, out of the 11 companies, 8 companies demonstrated practices with an emission intensity below 0.2 kilogram of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fragrance mixture. We see those regional variations, which we think are attributable to the general electricity mix in the different regions. So this is something maybe also for exchange with the governments and seeing what kind of regulations are being set up there. This will enable us also as producers in those countries to move forward. Finally, within Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, this big discrepancy between some companies reporting HFC emissions, others not doing it. This is something to be checked, hopefully by each company. And finally, we see that small and large companies are actually implementing best practices. So coming back to the start, how many companies participated in the survey and how many are already reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. I think there is room for improvement, but the results also show that actually it's possible. Yeah, as a small and as a large company, you can report greenhouse gas emissions. The standards are available, and I think someone has said it this morning. Yeah, you can only reduce what you measure. So this is really a reminder maybe for those companies who are not reporting yet to start it, to get onto that journey, and then look at the best practice examples that are shared, how to then reduce emissions. And now I think I hand over to Chima virtually, right? So thank you.